Just a few days before she would turn 21, a young girl with everything ahead of her would have her life stolen when what should have been a simple errand turned into a nightmare. For months prior to her demise, little did she know that she was being watched, being obsessed over, her very existence the object of another's desires. Although it seemed like the case was straightforward, it would take almost a decade for any form of justice to be received. A perpetrator who made Interpol's most wanted list, an international 9-year-long manhunt, and a grieving family who longed for some closure. This is the unbelievable story of a family's fight for justice. This is Chantelle Barnard's story. Hello and welcome back to Murder Mayhem, a Bella Monsoon exclusive production. I know, before you say anything, I know I said I was back and then I disappeared from YouTube again. I've been super busy, I know I keep saying that, but it really is true, and this time I can actually show you one of the things I've been doing, which is winning the DSTV Content Creator Cause Award. And yeah, if you want to see a little look into the event, into my outfit, into everything that took place and went down on the whole trip, because I did fly to another province to go to the event, then please do check out my social media channels. I will link them on screen now. I post daily content. I post little snippets of my life and what I'm doing outside of YouTube. And I also post a lot of cases that are currently in South African news. So whilst you wait for Murder and Mayhem episodes, you can check me out there. Okay, exciting news aside, for those of you who are new, let me introduce myself. If you are returning, you know the drill. You can skip ahead using the timestamp on screen. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. My knowledge and experience within the field ultimately led me to create the first trauma-informed South African true crime series. Within this series, I post new videos that look at real-life crimes from a psychological perspective. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy to understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your alley, then please do consider sticking around and joining the Ballaboo fam. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, no worries, I got you and I got you covered. You can find me on all major streaming channels for my sister podcast, Murder and Mayhem, South African True Crime. So just a quick disclaimer for today's narrative, which contains material citing murder and assault. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim mentioned nor her family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed, whilst spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode, as with all others, has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes, where available, real-life accounts, footage, and images of and from individuals involved directly in the case. So without further delay, let's get into it. In April of 1991, a baby girl was born to Suzette and Fanie Barnard. She would grow up with an older brother, Jacques, and the age gap between the two was only 11 months. Thus, they ended up becoming more like twins than siblings, according to Suzette. As the pair grew up, they shared many important moments, from writing matric to getting their driver's licenses at the same time. As a child, Chantelle was spontaneous and lovable, and she went out of her way to help others. She was always described as sensitive with impeccable manners, an ode to her upbringing. And as she became an adult, that never changed. Life was going well for Chantelle, who after finishing school decided to enroll in beauty college to pursue her dreams of working in the field. She also began to date Brandon Ackerman, and the two were smitten with one another. We're talking your first love. She was his first girlfriend, and the pair did everything together. Whilst Chantelle was in college, they wanted to move in together, but they didn't yet have the funds to do so. The struggles of being a university student. So many things you want to do, but just not enough funds to do them. It just so happened though that Brandon's mother had moved to Johannesburg from Cape Town and was looking for a place to stay. She ultimately found a space in a small holding in Benoni, and she would later invite the two to come and live with her. And so they had all moved in together. Chantelle was happy with the arrangement, as it meant that the commute to her college in Midrand was shorter, and that she of course was able to spend more time with Brandon. The individual who would later so brutally end her life was just a stone throw away, watching and waiting. And so life continued, and as time went on, Chantelle's living arrangement would come to an end around 5 months later, when Brandon's mother, Letitia, moved back to Cape Town. Unfortunately, as I previously mentioned, with student budgets, Brandon and Chantelle could not afford to keep staying in the residence, and so they had given notice and found alternative accommodation. They were happy that they had found somewhere new to stay, and Chantelle, well, she was actually out of grasp of the danger that she never knew was even lurking. That was, however, until the 31st of March 2011, just 10 days before she would turn 21. A day when a simple act would see her blossoming life come to a tragic and cruel end. But first, let me give you a small idea of Chantelle's day-to-day life. During the week, Chantelle would attend college, run errands, and later would pick up her boyfriend after he was done with work. On the 31st of March, she decided to pop over to the small holding that the pair had recently moved from to drop off their set of keys with the landlord, Roland. The residence, as I mentioned earlier, was in Benoni, East Rand, and she had made her way there in the late morning. The last time anyone would hear from her would be around 12 p.m. After not hearing from her the whole afternoon, and when she didn't arrive to pick up Brandon after work, the search for Chantelle began. As with many of the youth, myself included, it was highly unusual for her to not be reached via her phone or to have her phone switched off. Her boyfriend had thus borrowed a vehicle and headed straight to the small holding, the last place he knew Chantelle was supposed to have been. Her parents, frantic with worry at this point too, had also made their way there. At the residence on Doreen Road, Benoni, East Rand, Chantelle's vehicle was discovered, however she was nowhere to be seen. On the property itself, Roland was not present, but his son Jurgen, however, was there. He had greeted Suzette, Chantelle's mom, and engaged her in a conversation about her daughter. Although her first impression of this man was that nothing struck her as being particularly odd, something he said stuck with her, and it didn't sit well. He had casually remarked that Chantelle had been at the property but had left with a boy in a white vehicle, and the boy had smacked her bum on the way out. Suzette, however, knew her daughter very well, and so something inside of her told her that this narrative that he had shared just didn't make sense. The family had then gone to the local police station in Benoni to report her missing. Back at the small holding, however, Jurgen had visited another resident on the property, Andre de Barnard, and struck up a conversation. Immediately, Andre had spotted a bandage on Jurgen's hand and had asked him what had happened. Jurgen had then claimed that he had injured it when using an angle grinder, a handheld powered tool. Andre immediately clocked the lie, as in the past Jurgen had stated that he steered clear of any form of manual labor. Jurgen had then returned to his residence and locked the doors behind him. As the topic of Chantelle was being discussed by those in the area, as she was still missing of course, a disturbing piece of information would come to light. Earlier that afternoon, Andre's 9-year-old daughter, who was being looked after by her grandmother, had been playing outside when she had heard a woman scream, coming from the direction of Jurgen's property. She had then told her grandmother, who had later relayed the message when Andre had returned home, speaking about Chantelle. Immediately, the Barnards and the police were called. Suzette would race to the door of Jurgen's residence, banging on his windows, desperate to find her daughter. But there was no answer. A few moments later, however, an older man with a set of keys appeared, and one by one attempted to unlock the door. This man was Roland. Jürgen's father. However, it soon became clear that there was still a key in the door and it was locked from the inside. Before anyone could make a next move though, the door unlocked and in the doorframe stood the foreboding figure of Jürgen, dressed only in boxer shorts. In the light of the doorway, to Suzette at least, he definitely did not appear near as innocent as before. Suzette looked past him into his house, where she immediately spotted big splotches of red on the kitchen floor. Her heart had sunk. She then also noticed the bandage on Jürgen's hand and demanded to know where it was from. He stated that he had injured himself on an angle grinder, but then he had ripped the bandage off in a manner that was very unlike someone who had just been injured severely. And as the bandage came off, Suzette's horror increased, as it became very evident that the injury was from a bite mark between his thumb and index finger. He then stepped outside the house, where he was followed by the police, who made sure that he was going nowhere. Suzette, on the other hand, went further into the home, and the scene that met her there was one that she will never forget. The television was on, frozen on an adult movie scene, a woman without clothing captured in a still image, and a blanket was lying on the ground. Instinctively, Suzette had picked it up to move it out the way. Next to it, however, was a thick puddle of what she immediately knew was blood. And a little further on, a pool cue in that very puddle. And in the corner she saw underwear. Underwear that she recognized from years of doing her daughter's laundry. That underwear, she was certain, belonged to Chantelle. She immediately screamed, and in a moment her husband was by her side. She couldn't just leave though, knowing that her daughter was more than likely inside this home and potentially needed her help. And so she went into another room in the house and opened the door. And at around 10 p.m. that night, she made the discovery that will be forever etched in her mind. She had entered the dark room, reached for the light, and switched it on. In the next moment, she saw what she would later describe as a porcelain doll lying on the floor. Chantelle's lifeless body was lying on the floor, legs spread with her ankle-strapped closed shoes still on. She was lying on a blanket, and around her there were pairs of underwear, as well as a makeup palette and shaving foam. Her body did not have one drop of blood on it, and it appeared that she had been bathed, her hair still damp. Her hands had wounds on them, from where she had evidently fought back, holding the weapon that had struck her. Her neck showcased a deep wound. Her face was blue and her mouth was swollen. At the scene of the crime, Jürgen's t-shirt with blood on it was discovered. Immediately, an arrest was made, and Jürgen was led to the police van as police officers and medical personnel flooded the scene. Upon hearing the news, Brandon, her boyfriend, understandably lost his mind. He was in utter disbelief, furious at Jürgen and inconsolable. Whilst the police were occupied inside, he would break the windows of Jürgen's buggy, his truck. Along with a group of others, they had also attempted to set the police van that had Jürgen contained within it on fire using petrol. Spoiler alert, that plan didn't work out though. Jürgen was later taken to the police station and then the magistrate's court. There, the 37-year-old Belgium national was charged with the and murder of Chantelle Barnard. Jürgen was then remanded into custody, and his initial bail application would be denied. His passport was seized, and the case was then postponed for further investigation. And in the days that followed, so many disturbing revelations would come to light. A bread knife with blood on it containing the DNA of both Jürgen and Chantelle was also discovered at the crime scene. And in true crime documentary style, further insights into the man arrested would showcase a pattern of disturbing behavior that potentially went unnoticed and unreported. If you're familiar with the genre, you'll know that this is more common than not. There were so many signs that were missed. As it turned out, Jürgen was obsessed with Chantelle from the moment that he had laid eyes upon her. She, however, besides having a boyfriend whom she cared for, had thought that Jürgen was a bit odd, as she would catch him eyeing her up and down on many occasions. And if you're a woman in particular who has experienced this type of interaction, you will realize just how uncomfortable that can make one feel. Over the weeks that she was living on the plot, she would notice that on many occasions, underwear and even her work pants, in one instance, went missing from the washing line. At the time, it couldn't be proven, but there were suspicions that Jürgen was to blame. and later in his home, along with her work pants, her handbag, and her underwear was found. On her pants, he had drawn in blood an arrow pointing to her genitals with the words, "Fuck me." So Jürgen, it's evident to see, was definitely a bit on the creepy stalker side, to say the least. Not much more is known about him though, besides the fact that he was married at one point. But I can imagine that there must have been other signs that were potentially ignored or brushed over. This is often the case with offenders who commit such heinous crimes. As the case continued, Jürgen would blame his ex-wife for the murder, stating that he suffered from epilepsy, experienced a fit, and then somehow awoke to see Chantelle on the floor and his ex-wife in the vicinity. Yeah, that makes absolutely zero sense to me either. But anyways. Chantelle was soon laid to rest in a ceremony at the AFM church on the 6th of April in Meyersdal. Just less than a week later, she would have been turning 21. 3 bouquets adorned her casket. One to mark her death, one to mark the birthday that she would never celebrate, and the last to mark the wedding day that would never take place. In the days that followed, her family and her brother and boyfriend in particular were both inconsolable. Brandon was on antidepressants for 3 months, and for the years to follow couldn't handle the topic of Chantelle being brought up. She was his first love, and the pain that came with that heartbreak was unbearable. And all the family had to hold on to was the hope that justice would be served. Jürgen, in the meanwhile, was being held in custody, desperately attempting to be granted bail. He was so desperate, in fact, that he approached the Supreme Court for another bail application. And this time, however, 8 months later, he was for some reason successful. He was granted 20,000 Rand bail, with strict instructions to report to the Benoni police station 3 times a week, from 7 to 10 a.m. His court case was still ongoing, but a major spoke in the proverbial wheel was soon to follow. As soon as the court came to session one Monday morning on the 9th of September, Jürgen didn't pitch. Yep, you heard me. He vanished off the face of the planet. Or so it seemed. Immediately, the search for him began, and extra charges of contempt of court, as well as breach of bail conditions, were added to the charge sheet. He had left a note for his niece, which read, and I quote, "To my dearest niece Angela, I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. I love you very much and very proud of you. You, my niece, and you mean the world to me. Keep your head high and stay devoted to your family. Please look after Omar and Opa. Don't let anything happen to any one of them. Please hope you can forgive me for leaving, as I ask the same for them, because I'm not going to go to prison for 25 years to life for a crime I didn't do. Please tell your father, my brother, I love him very much and look after himself, and he means a lot to me, and that he come to South Africa." End quote. But one would think that he couldn't have gone that far, possibly. Right? Especially since he didn't have his travel documents. Well, just a short while later, as luck, or as I like to believe, the 6 degrees of separation theory would have it, he was sighted in Maputo Airport in Mozambique. Sighted and photographed by none other than a photographer who was employed by a major South African newspaper. Talk about coincidence, right? After the sighting, however, the proverbial trail went cold. There was the belief circulating that he caught a flight to Kenya and then onto Europe. It was suspected that he was hiding with family back in Belgium. During this time, Chantelle's family did everything they could to find the man who was accused of ending their loved one's life. But it felt as though their efforts were in vain. Jürgen would end up on the Interpol's most wanted list, as his image was circulated widely across social media, in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would recognize him. But days turned into months, months into years, and as time passed, the pain the Barnards felt, especially Suzette, Chantelle's mother, only became more intense. She would state, and I quote, "I am terribly angry at everyone and at everything. When I walk somewhere and see children of Chantelle's age, I get a lump in my throat. When I hear about someone organizing a wedding for their daughter, it's all taken away." End quote. And the years went on. In 2019, the year Chantelle would have turned 29 years old, there was still not one sign of Jürgen, and no peace or closure felt by those who had lost Chantelle all those years ago. Suzette had said, and I quote, "I have not made peace with her death. How can a mother make peace when her child has been taken away from her like this? How can I make peace with these circumstances? It feels like nobody cares and like Chantelle didn't mean anything. Someone who was just a breath of fresh air for them, the police, was swept under the rug." End quote. For 6.5 years, Jürgen was untraceable, eluding both the police as well as private investigators. Mike Bolhuis, a renowned investigator, was thus brought onto the case. His team liaised with Interpol to share information. A police facial identification unit was also involved to digitally create 8 possibilities of what Jürgen may be looking like, as many believed he was deeply disguised in order to be passing unnoticed. Also, given the fact that he didn't have a Belgian passport, or any passport at all at the time, and just when it felt like all hope was lost, everything changed. And just like that, 9 years after Jürgen had absconded, he handed himself in to the Benoni police station. His arrival was accompanied by his lawyer and his father, the latter of which would later be divulged as having been the driving force to him popping back up again. The details surrounding his almost decade-long absence are still murky, at least to the public, that is. But according to insider sources, he was hiding out in Vietnam before he had returned to South Africa under a false passport and identity. Chantelle's family, especially her mother, were overwhelmed by the news, but deeply relieved that the case could finally be resumed. And then, of course, 2020 happened. The trial and court appearances were delayed several times, with 11 witnesses testifying, but Jürgen declining to take the stand. He would, however, later apparently state to Chantelle's mother that her daughter enjoyed what he did to her and that she didn't even plead for her life. I'm sorry, what? Chantelle's post-mortem report would detail the horrific and painful death that she had experienced. Please note disturbing details to follow. Some of her wounds included, but were not limited to, multiple cut wounds to the front and back of her neck, injuries on her chest, front teeth that were loose, an injured left ring finger, a swollen face and a blue eye, and an injured left knee. And almost a decade later, further details of the events of that day would finally come to light. That day, Jürgen had requested their domestic worker to leave for the day in question, as he told her that he had work to do. She would later state that it was unusual, as she often worked even when he had errands to run. He, however, had wanted no interruptions for that day, for reasons that would unfortunately only make sense to everyone later. After he had brutally taken Chantelle's life, as I mentioned earlier, he would then attempt to wash her body to destroy evidence. And it was shortly around this point when he had been discovered. Eventually, in September of 2020, a verdict was passed by the High Court in Benoni. Jürgen van der Kier was found guilty on charges of murder and defeating the ends of justice. During the reading of the verdict, he showed zero emotion or remorse, seemingly unperturbed. A few days later, in the middle of September 2020, Jürgen van der Kier was sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder and rape of Chantelle Barnard. Additionally, the High Court handed the 42-year-old 5 years for defeating the ends of justice. This charge had stemmed from evidence that he washed Chantelle's body at the time of her murder, amongst other things, in an attempt to get rid of his DNA. The sentences were set to be served concurrently. After the sentence, Suzette would say, and I quote, "It's not going to bring her back. It won't take away the pain either, but it will bring us peace, that he finally pays for what he did to her and that his life cannot go on as before." End quote. The actions of this man, Jürgen, showcase the importance of being able to identify problematic behaviors and negative traits within those around us. Remember though, each person and each case is unique, so it's not a one-size-fits-all type of deal. That being said, let's quickly dip our toes into the pool of disturbing. The most commonly occurring behavior is what can be termed antisocial behavior. Whilst being introverted or shy isn't a problem in the least, extreme antisocial tendencies like consistently refusing to interact with others or an obsession with control and manipulation can definitely hint at deeper issues. So antisocial traits and tendencies are not necessarily what we understand by the term antisocial. Keep that in mind. But let's move on to voyeurism, the thrill from watching people without their knowledge. This is something that many individuals who later become involved in disturbing crimes are obsessed with. In Jürgen's case in particular, this involved watching, obsessing, and later stealing Chantelle's items. As you can see, a very clear escalation of behavior. Often, these individuals create a blueprint in their mind of how the interaction with the object of their desires will turn out. They fixate upon this dream until the opportunity arises where they can convert their dream into a reality. But as I'm sure you can imagine, more often than not, reality does not live up to this fantasy that they have created within their minds. And unfortunately, for the object of their desires, the consequences can be fatal. So, although there is not much available on the life and times of Jürgen prior to the crime he committed, I'm almost certain that many signs may have been overlooked. As has been seen in the most recent ongoing case as of October of 2024 in the murder of Devaney Null in a school in Overberg, the alleged perpetrator has a history of problematic and disturbing behavior. Behavior that repeatedly went undealt with or unpunished, if you will. And for those asking, yes, I will be covering Devaney's case as soon as court proceedings have concluded. This case also highlighted a growing unease and danger, especially felt within women worldwide. Gender-based violence in South Africa has reached pandemic levels, affecting women from all walks of life on a daily basis. South Africa in particular holds one of the highest rates of intimate partner violence, femicide, and sexual assault globally. Not exactly something to be proud of. I mean, it was my work in the fight against gender-based violence in South Africa that won me the Cause Award in the DSTV Content Creators Awards that took place just a few days ago in South Africa. Statistics reveal that a woman is murdered every 3 hours in our country, most often by someone she knows, highlighting the systemic nature of gender-based violence. The impact of GBV is devastating, both physically and emotionally. Many survivors live in fear of retaliation if they speak out, often suffering in silence. Trauma, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are common psychological effects, and the physical violence can result in lifelong disabilities or even death. Daily, women find themselves in horrendous situations, be it in their home, workplaces, or even public spaces. Stories of women being abused, raped, or murdered have become a regular feature in the media, reflecting the scale of crisis in our country. In South Africa, public transport and urban areas are notorious hotspots for harassment and assault, with many women feeling unsafe walking alone, even in daylight hours. For Chantelle, it was the simple errand of dropping keys off that resulted in her death. For Uyenene, picking up a parcel from the post office was the only mistake she would make that day. This constant threat to our safety forces us to alter our behaviors, such as avoiding certain areas or traveling with companions in order to minimize risk. But the dangers are everywhere. How can we even anticipate them if they could pop up anywhere, at any time? Especially in places we consider to be safe spaces. Our homes. For many though, myself included, these precautions have become a grim part of daily life. I mean, I offer an entire range of self-defense products to South Africans because of the reality we face daily. That reality drove me to seek some form of solutions. Whilst awareness of GBV has increased in recent years, thanks to movements like Am I Next, organizations like Women for Change, and the government's declaration, finally, of GBV as a national crisis, so much more remains to be done. Like I just mentioned, it is organizations like Women for Change and local activists who are at the forefront of fighting for systemic change. But until societal attitudes towards women shift, and until perpetrators are consistently held accountable, women in South Africa will continue to live under the constant threat of violence. And that's a simple fact. And you can quote me on that one. As we close this chapter on the tragic and largely unknown murder of Chantelle Barnard, we're left with haunting questions about justice and safety. Her killer, Jurgen van der Keur, was someone she knew, someone who would go on to evade justice for almost a decade. With each passing year, her family fought tirelessly to keep her story alive, whilst he slipped into the shadows, even landing on Interpol's most wanted list. But in the end, luckily and thankfully, justice prevailed for her. So many others, however, have not had that ending to their narratives, though. This case reminds us that evil can lurk behind familiar, seemingly innocent faces, and that the fight for justice is rarely swift. Chantelle's memory deserves to be honored and her story told, so that one less voice is silenced by injustice. Thank you again for being with me throughout this episode and for helping me to continue to shine a light on stories that the world may have forgotten. I appreciate you all. Fly high, Chantelle. May you rest in peace. Until the next one, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know you all are, or at least are capable of being. Bella out. Bye!